Arthur Dayne stood at the prow of the lone vessel cutting across the waves, the worn lines of the sail catching the morning sunlight in a gentle glow. The ship was modest, hardly the sort of grand war galley one might expect from a knight as renowned as the Sword of the Morning. But it was seaworthy, its hull solid, and it carried enough supplies and provisions for the quest that Arthur had begun. Within his mind, half-formed memories flickered like distant sails on the horizon. Memories of battles on land, of the Tower of Joy, of vows that bound him to a vision of honor that had been shaken by the war. Still, he pressed forward, his eyes fixed not upon what was behind, but on the vast waters spread out before him. He felt the tug of the tide beneath his feet, that primal force pulling and releasing as though it were teasing him with the promise of either doom or glory. Arthur had known many forms of battle in his life, all of them on dry land. The ephemeral dance of armies, the crash of cavalry, the ring of steel on steel. These were the songs he had been raised to dance to. Yet here he was, forging a path across the Stepstones, those notorious islands between Dorne and Essos, a place rife with smugglers, pirates, slavers, and exiles from all corners of the known world. He could not have predicted that his life would lead him to the sea, but perhaps the sea had been calling him all along. In a world turned upside down by rebellions and shifting loyalties, Arthur sought a purpose that would serve the realm, and the realm, he felt, included these treacherous waters. He remembered the conversation with Prince Doran Martell in Sunspear, the earnest debate on whether the Stepstones could truly be tamed. That battered archipelago had never known lasting peace. Every king or prince who claimed them did so in name only, for no sooner would a power fade in Westeros or in the free cities than a new brood of pirates and brigands would rise. Ships would be plundered, their crew left to drown or sold in flesh markets in Lys or Myr. The merchants and lords along the narrow sea had grown accustomed to bribing pirate lords to keep at least some routes open. But Arthur Dayne had felt a stirring in his heart, a spark of righteous indignation at the notion that innocent people suffered because no one dared to bring real justice to these waters. Perhaps it was arrogance, perhaps idealism, but he was determined to try. Had he died at the Tower of Joy, as many believed, there would have been no further chapters to his story. He would have been one more memory in the annals of the Seven Kingdoms, recalled in songs about his shining sword Dawn, or about the storied battles he had fought in King Aerys' name. But Arthur had not died. How he survived was a secret that only a handful of souls knew, and even fewer understood. Whatever bargains were struck or fortunes shifted that day, he had found himself spared. When he parted ways with his sworn brothers, the Kingsguard had been in disarray. Some called him an oathbreaker for leaving, though the crown had already changed, and the vow he once served was tangled in broken illusions. Prince Rhaegar was gone, as was the dream of a Targaryen restoration under his wise rule. Arthur had roamed for a time, searching for meaning or for a cause, unwilling simply to hide in the shadows. Eventually, he had chosen to return to Dorne in secret. He might have lived out the rest of his days in quiet exile, hidden away in some far-flung corner of Sunspear or a dusty keep in the Dornish marches. But that did not sit right with him. Something in him still burned brightly, the same spirit that had guided him to serve as a Kingsguard in the first place. The desire to protect, to stand for what was just and good. The war had tarnished many illusions, but it had not diminished that core principle. And so, as the realm settled under the reign of King Robert Baratheon, Arthur Dayne set his eyes upon a new challenge, the Stepstones. If he could do some good there, stop the predations of pirates, offer safe passage for merchant ships, and protect the vulnerable, then perhaps his life might regain some sense of honor. Perhaps the realm would remember that there remained knights who cared for something more than gold and glory. It was in Dorne that the seeds of his new idea took shape. At first, it began as a loose notion. Gather skilled fighters, set sail, patrol the Stepstones, and disrupt the pirates. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this could be more than a personal quest. It could be an institution, a brotherhood of knights dedicated to safeguarding the sea lanes, operating outside the immediate realm of kings and lords, focused solely on justice at sea. He had begun to call it, in quiet moments, the Order of the Morning's Light, inspired by his own title as Sword of the Morning and the unyielding principle that dawn always breaks through the darkness. But he never announced that name publicly, not until he was certain he had enough men and resources to make it real. The first knights who joined him were men he had known before the rebellion, fellow Dornish or knights sworn once to House Dayne's banner, who still believed in his honor. They came quietly to a small cove near Starfall, where Arthur had arranged a pair of ships. The plan was hush-hush, for he did not want King Robert's new regime to see it as a threat. Indeed, if anyone asked, he would say that he and his small band were privateers tasked by the Lords of Dorne to protect Dornish merchant routes. Robert might have found it suspicious if he knew the famed Arthur Dayne was alive, but for the moment the crown's attention was elsewhere. King Robert was busy consolidating his power, dealing with rebellions in the Iron Islands, and enjoying the spoils of victory. The new regime often overlooked the more distant corners of Westeros, and so Arthur found a measure of safety in Dorne's relative autonomy. And so, under the light of a pale dawn, Arthur and a dozen knights made their vows on the deck of a ship swaying in the tide. Each man placed his hand upon Dawn, the ancestral sword of House Dayne, which Arthur had reclaimed from the Tower of Joy. That sword gleamed, seeming almost to glow with its own radiance under the rising sun. They pledged to one another that they would act as protectors of the innocent who traversed the Stepstones, to keep to knightly virtues of courage, mercy, and honor, and to fight the wicked who preyed on merchants and travelers. They called themselves the Knights of the Morning's Light, though to the outside world, they remained an unnamed band of adventurers, or so it seemed. Their first forays proved as dangerous as any land battle. The Stepstones were not simply a stretch of open sea. They were dotted with rocky isles, hidden coves, labyrinthine reefs, and countless hideouts favored by pirates and raiders. The wind could change in an instant, blowing from the southeast in the morning and swirling unpredictably by night. Treacherous currents threatened to smash their ships against the craggy edges if they ventured too close. The men had to learn quickly how to navigate these hazards. Many had never handled the rigging of a ship, but they were knights and knights could adapt. Arthur led by example, learning from the sailors he had hired, lending his own strength when the sails needed hoisting, and manning the oars when the wind failed them. In the early days, they encountered scattered pirates who gave them little trouble. A few broken-down galleys or fishing boats turned reaver vessels were no match for knights who knew discipline. The pirates, caught off guard, often scattered as soon as they glimpsed the lethal shimmer of dawn at Arthur's hip or saw the professional formation of armed men. But soon enough, word spread that some band of Dornish knights had decided to play at war in these waters. Larger pirate crews began to take notice. Some wanted to test the mettle of these self-proclaimed protectors of the sea lanes. Others placed bounties on their heads. For so long, the Stepstones had belonged to no one but the criminals or petty lords who rose and fell with the tides. The notion of a stable force of honorable knights was almost laughable to the old sea dogs. They believed it was only a matter of time before Arthur and his knights vanished beneath the waves. But Arthur was not deterred. He knew that small victories would build the Order's reputation and lure in more support. And so, after securing the blessing, albeit unofficial, of Prince Doran, Arthur began contacting traders from the free cities who wanted safer passage. Step by careful step, coin began trickling in as merchants paid the knights to escort them. Arthur used that coin to hire more sailors, buy better ships, and slowly expand their presence. Whenever possible, they rescued captured crews, offering them safe passage back to their home ports. Some of those freed men chose to stay, enthralled by the idea that there still existed knights who stood by a code of honor. Thus, the Order of the Morning's Light grew not only in numbers but in renown. Before long, Arthur had a small but formidable squadron of 3 ships, the Dawnstar, the Bright Spear, and the Seafarer's Oath. Each was captained by a knight he trusted. They took turns patrolling, rotating watchful eyes across the Stepstones, intercepting suspicious vessels, and attacking pirate hideouts whenever they found them. They learned the tides, memorized the hidden channels, and charted the location of the worst pirate dens. Sometimes they fought fiercely, clashing swords on rocking decks under the blazing sun, boarding pirate ships with a fearless zeal. Other times they negotiated, allowing lesser smugglers to pass if they carried only mild contraband, focusing instead on the slavers and cutthroats who truly tormented innocent folk. Arthur's leadership style was both stern and merciful, for he believed that in that harsh environment, showing a glimmer of humanity could foster alliances rather than create endless cycles of revenge. Yet those who preyed on the weak found no quarter with him. Over the months and then the years, stories began to spread from port to port. Whispers of a knight with silvered hair who wielded a blade that seemed to shine with the light of dawn itself echoed from Lys to Mere, from Old Town to King's Landing. Sailors, once skeptical, told tales of how they had seen pirates turn to quivering wretches at the mere sight of Arthur Dayne's banner, the seven-pointed star on a field of radiant white. Others spoke of a ghostly ship that appeared out of the morning fog to defend them from raiders, only to vanish again as quickly as it came. In Bravos, Volantis, Pentos, and beyond, these stories made their way into taverns, fueling songs and rumor. Some doubted the stories, thinking them exaggerated accounts typical of sailors, but the more credible merchants attested that they had indeed seen these knights on the open sea, clad in armor that caught the sunlight like polished mirrors, defending honest trade with unwavering resolve. Arthur himself became a legend at sea, even more than he had been a legend on land. On land, many still believed him dead, and perhaps that added to the mystique. Stories began circulating that the Sword of the Morning had been resurrected by the Lady of the Waves, or that Dawn was an enchanted sword that guided his ship through the blackest nights. Others said he had made a pact with Merlings or had discovered a secret path to the far side of the world. Arthur paid no heed to these wild rumors, other than to note that fear of the unknown could work to his advantage. If pirates hesitated because they believed he could call down the wrath of the sea, so much the better. The Stepstones, however, were not a place to be tamed by mere rumor. In the second year of their campaign, the Order of the Morning's Light began to face coordinated pushback. Several pirate captains banded together, forming a loose confederation that sought to reclaim their stranglehold on the trade routes. They recognized that Arthur's order was small in number, no matter how well-trained or led. This confederation gathered in the hidden coves of the island chain known as Bloodstone, setting traps and planning raids. Arthur caught wind of their alliance from a pair of Pentoshi smugglers who, after being boarded by the Knights of the Morning's Light, decided to share what they knew. The pirate lords, they said, had grown tired of losing ships and coin and had put a large bounty on Arthur's head. They meant to lure his knights into a trap and destroy them all in a single decisive confrontation. Arthur had little choice but to prepare for a larger conflict than he had ever fought at sea. His knights were prepared to stand with him, but many of them had concerns. How could 3 or 4 ships hope to hold off a confederation of pirates that could number in the dozens? Some advised forging an alliance with local sell-sail companies, while others spoke of requesting help from Prince Doran or even from King Robert's fleet. But the Stepstones were a distant worry for the crown, and by then, the tension between the new Baratheon regime and Dorne still lingered after the war. Arthur feared that involving too many parties would entangle them in new political intrigues, potentially undermining their independence. Instead, he devised another plan. He gathered his captains aboard the Dawnstar one night, the lanterns swinging in the salty breeze. The ship bobbed gently under the starlight. Arthur stood at the center of the deck, Dawn sheathed at his side, explaining that if the pirates wanted a trap, the knights would be the ones to spring it. They would sail into the heart of the Stepstones, making it appear as though they had grown reckless. Once the pirates rallied to attack, Arthur's men would strike at their leadership. He had learned from a captured pirate that the Confederation was led by a cunning man known as Harrag the Cunning, a former Ironborn reaver who had carved a bloody path through these waters. Harrag had at his command several swift longships, each manned by fierce raiders. If Harrag were removed, the alliance might crumble under lesser captains. The plan, Arthur explained, was as dangerous as it was bold. They would need to rely on speed and surprise, striking before the pirates could converge their full strength. The knights listened quietly, each man glancing at the others to gauge their resolve. They could see the determination in Arthur's eyes, that unwavering spark that had made him the Sword of the Morning. None among them voiced a doubt. They might have feared the odds, but they trusted Arthur's courage and leadership more. Their vow had bound them, and they would not falter. In the weeks that followed, they set their bait. The bright spear sailed conspicuously along one of the busiest routes, only lightly escorted. It made sure to be spotted by passing ships that carried news to the pirates. The Dawn Star and the Seafarer's Oath lingered just out of sight, hidden in the labyrinthine channels of the Stepstones, waiting. Soon enough, Harrag the Cunning took the bait. His longships darted out from a rocky inlet, flanked by a handful of allied pirate sloops. They moved in a pincer formation, certain that the lone knightly vessel was overextended. The Bright Spear's crew, braced for battle, feigned a panicked attempt to flee, as though they had not expected such overwhelming numbers. Then, at Arthur's signal, the hidden ships raced forth, sails snapping in the wind. The Dawnstar struck from behind, ramming one of Harrag's supporting ships before its crew realized what was happening. Knights in gleaming armor clambered over the rail, swords and spears flashing. The Seafarer's Oath peppered the pirates with arrows, picking them off from a distance. Aboard the Bright Spear, a pitched battle raged on deck as the knights fought hand-to-hand with Harrag's men. For a moment, the swirling chaos threatened to overwhelm them. Salt spray and blood spattered the planks. Screams mingled with the clang of steel. But Arthur, bounding across a narrow boarding plank from the Dawnstar to Harrag's flagship, led a charge so fierce that the pirates wavered. He found Harrag near the aft castle, a big man with arms like tree trunks, clad in mismatched armor that bore the scars of past raids. Harrag roared a challenge at the legendary knight, and they met in a deafening clash of blades. The pirate's axe hummed through the air, and Arthur parried with dawn, the pure white blade seeming to slice through the gloom of the battle as though it carried its own light. Sparks flew, and the men around them drew back to watch the duel. Harrag was strong, but Arthur was swift, graceful, and precise. He sidestepped a sweeping blow and slashed across Harrag's chest. The pirate howled, staggering. Arthur pressed his advantage, driving Harrag back until the pirate's boots slid in a pool of blood near the stern. The final blow came swiftly, a clean thrust that pierced Harrag's heart. In that instant, Harrag's roar died in his throat, replaced by a choking gasp. He toppled to the deck, lifeless. All around them, the pirate ranks broke. Seeing their leader fall by the hand of the sword of the morning shattered whatever cohesion had held them together. The knights, energized by the victory, pressed forward, capturing or slaying any who resisted. A few pirate ships turned tail and fled, scattering into the open sea. The combined might of the Confederation had failed to crush Arthur's order in one swift stroke. Instead, it had been undone by its reliance on Harrag's leadership. In the aftermath, Arthur and his knights found themselves with an unexpected prize. Half a dozen pirate ships, more or less intact, and a handful of captured pirates who were willing to bargain for their lives. Among the contraband they seized were chests of gold, barrels of Myrish wine, and a variety of stolen artifacts, ranging from gilded Bravosi mirrors to bizarre trinkets rumored to be of Valyrian origin. Arthur's men wanted to divide the spoils as they saw fit, but Arthur insisted on a measured approach. They would use the captured gold to refit the ships, hire more loyal sailors, and compensate the families of any knights who had fallen in battle. To remind everyone of their higher purpose, he oversaw the distribution of some wealth to freed slaves and impoverished fishers on nearby islands, ensuring that the name of the Order of the Morning's Light would be associated not just with martial prowess but also with mercy and generosity. In this way, Arthur's legend grew. Over time, more knights, sellswords, and even a few exiled lords found their way to the Stepstones, seeking to join his cause. Some came out of genuine admiration for Arthur's ideals, while others merely sought to bask in the glory of his reputation. Arthur was wary of opportunists, but he could not afford to be overly selective if he hoped to maintain and expand his control over the waters. So he accepted recruits, subjecting them to oaths and small tests of honor, making it clear that while bravery was important, compassion was essential. Whenever he found a man wanting, he would discharge him from service rather than risk corruption within the order. Still, the ranks grew. He found himself training these new arrivals not just in swordsmanship but in seamanship, forging them into a cohesive brotherhood that could handle both the rigors of open combat and the subtler arts of diplomacy on the sea. As the Order's strength increased, so did its responsibilities. Entire villages on smaller islands that had been living in terror of pirate raids began to see Arthur Dayne's knights as protectors. They brooked their grievances to him, begging for help against local tyrants or visiting slavers. At times, Arthur felt pulled in many directions, uncertain if the mission had outgrown his ability to oversee it personally. But he persevered, understanding that leadership was not only about brandishing a sword, but also about forging alliances, keeping morale high, and setting clear principles. He placed knights he trusted in command of various outposts on the more strategic islands. Together, they built a loose network of fortifications and safe harbors. In King's Landing, rumors persisted that the famed Sword of the Morning was still alive and was now the self-styled Lord of the Stepstones. Some at court scoffed, dismissing these stories as wild fantasies or ghost tales. But the merchants who traveled regularly through those waters brought a different perspective. They spoke of a renewed sense of security, a blessing for trade, though it came with a price, an expectation of courtesy and decency. Slavers found their trade routes disrupted, and the black markets in Lys and Myr complained that they were losing coin. Some powerful interests in the free cities took notice. For every merchant who blessed Arthur's knights, there was a slaver prince who cursed them. Over time, the tension between these opposing interests inevitably rose. In Volantis, certain powerful dynasties who profited from the slave trade began sending gold to the remaining pirates, encouraging them to unite and resist Arthur's order. Secret letters made their way to noble houses in Westeros that harbored old grudges or saw Arthur Dayne's survival as a threat to King Robert's established reign. Whispers in certain corners of the Red Keep suggested that Robert Baratheon himself might eventually dispatch a royal fleet to the Stepstones to put an end to these vigilante knights. After all, who was Arthur Dayne to claim dominion over waters that were, at least nominally, under the purview of the Iron Throne? However, Robert was a man of simpler dispositions. Some said that privately, he was intrigued by the rumors of Arthur's new exploits, that the prospect of a knightly order successfully battling pirates appealed to his warrior's soul. For the moment, at least, the crown did nothing. In the face of mounting external threats, Arthur knew he had to solidify his order. It was no longer enough to be a loose brotherhood of idealistic knights. They needed structure, a system of ranks and responsibilities, and a code that was clearly understood and enforced. Gathering his most trusted lieutenants aboard the Bright Spear one evening, he outlined the idea of formal knighthood within the Order of the Morning's Light, complete with ceremonies to induct new members and a uniform that would identify them as part of something greater than themselves. Each knight would swear to uphold the 7 virtues, to protect the innocent at sea, to show mercy where possible, and to be unyielding against those who enslaved or preyed on the weak. The symbol they chose was a rising sun, stylized in white and gold, often stitched onto the left breast of their surcoats or painted onto the sails of their ships. Arthur believed the dawn motif represented not only House Dayne's ancient heritage but also the concept of renewal. The idea that even in the blackest night, morning light would come to banish the darkness. Standing before these gathered knights, Arthur explained that each of them represented that hope for the small folk scattered across the Stepstones. Their presence meant rescue, relief, and a shield against the tide of cruelty that had long plagued these waters. The knights listened in rapt silence. Many felt a stirring in their hearts they had not experienced since the War of the Ninepenny Kings or Robert's Rebellion. It was as if a new, noble purpose had descended upon them, reminding them why knighthood had been revered in the first place. After that meeting, the Order's presence became undeniable. Crews of honest traders knew to look for the white and gold sun on the horizon, often cheering when they saw it. Pirates and slavers likewise watched anxiously, for the sight of those sails meant that they might face a deadly encounter. In taverns from Old Volantis to King's Landing, sailors swapped tales of how the Knights of the Morning's Light had driven off entire fleets of corsairs with cunning maneuvers and unwavering bravery. The name of Arthur Dayne became legendary in a new way, no longer just the sword that had bested the Kingswood Brotherhood or that had served the Targaryen crown, but now a champion of the sea. But for all the glory, the Stepstones remained a place of shifting alliances and hidden dangers. Many islands were still beyond the Knights' reach, and new pirate captains emerged all the time, emboldened by the prospect of collecting that hefty bounty some of the slaver lords had placed on Arthur's head. One night, while patrolling near the island known as Scorpion's Shell, the Knights found a trap waiting for them. A group of slavers from Lys had hired the services of a rogue red priest from Volantis, a man rumored to wield shadowy powers. He had set up an ambush with 3 ships, each larger and better armed than the typical pirate vessels. The knights aboard the Seafarer's Oath were outnumbered, the black water around them lit by strange, flickering torches that gave off smoke smelling of sulfur. Before Arthur could arrive with reinforcements, the Seafarer's Oath was boarded by brutal, half-crazed men chanting the Red Priest's incantations. The knights fought fiercely, but they were cornered, struggling to hold their own against an enemy that seemed possessed by zeal. Some knights fell that night, cut down or hurled overboard into the churning sea. Had Arthur not arrived at the last moment with the Dawnstar and the bright spear, the entire ship might have been lost. The final clash saw Arthur himself facing the Red Priest on the deck slippery with blood. The priest brandished a blade glowing red-hot, chanting prayers to Lawler. Arthur could feel the heat emanating from that cursed weapon, as though it had been pulled from a furnace. Their duel was swift and vicious, the priest's fanatical strength pushing Arthur to parry blow after blow, but Arthur's skill prevailed. In a single, decisive strike, he cut down the priest, whose dying breath filled the night air with ash and smoke. That victory tasted bittersweet. Several good knights had been killed, and the knights discovered cages of enslaved women and children in the hold of the slavers' ships. Setting them free, Arthur felt a surge of rage at the cruelty he beheld. Yet the gratitude he saw in the eyes of those rescued renewed his resolve. It reminded him that for every knight who died in this struggle, countless more lives were saved from cruelty and bondage. Still, nights like that one weighed heavily on his conscience. He had chosen this life of perpetual battle, and it was a burden that grew heavier with each fallen comrade. He found respite in brief moments, like watching the sunrise over the water, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, or in the quiet nights when the sea was calm and he stood at the bow of the Dawnstar, letting the wind ruffle his silvered hair. In those moments, he would think of Ashera, of the family he had left behind in Starfall, and wonder if he would ever see them again without the weight of this endless war on his shoulders. But he never allowed himself to be consumed by longing or regret. Too many people depended on the knights now, and if he wavered, the entire endeavor might collapse. In the 3rd year of the Order's presence, a new threat emerged from the east. A coalition of slaver cities had decided enough was enough. There was profit to be made in the Stepstones, whether through capturing passing ships or using the archipelago as a staging ground for raids into Westeros. Arthur's knights stood in the way of those profits. Several wealthy slaver princes formed a pact, pooling resources to hire elite cell sales and mercenary captains. They also used their connections with unscrupulous magisters to procure advanced siege weapons, scorpions, spitfires, and even rumored alchemical substances meant to set entire decks ablaze with green fire. They planned to launch a full-scale assault on the heart of Arthur's territory, retake the strategic islands, and either kill or capture the legendary knight. Once again, Arthur found himself in a difficult predicament. His knights had grown in number and skill, but they were still a fraction of the size of an organized mercenary navy. And these slavers had the advantage of near-limitless gold. Word reached him through a network of informants in Lys that the mercenary armada was set to sail within weeks. Some of his men questioned if they should evacuate the smaller islands and fall back to a defensible position, perhaps near a major city like Sunspear or even Old Town, where the knights might coordinate with local powers. Others argued that doing so would cede the Stepstones back to their old ways, betraying everything the Order had worked for. Arthur listened to all viewpoints, then made a decision. They would stand their ground. If the Stepstones were to be made safe, it would not be through retreat. He summoned every ship he could command, calling in markers from allies they had aided, traders from Pentos and Bravos, a few lords from the Dornish coast who had quietly supported his cause, and independent captains who admired what the knights stood for. He negotiated deals with a handful of small-time pirate crews who had renounced slavery and had allied themselves with the knights for a share of legitimate trade. By promising them clemency for their past crimes if they turned on the slavers, Arthur managed to thin the ranks of potential enemies. It was a fragile alliance, one held together by threads of trust, coin, and mutual hatred for those who dealt in human lives. As the mercenary fleet drew closer, Arthur's men worked day and night to prepare. Archers practiced firing flaming arrows across the waves. Alchemists tinkered with burning oils that might counter the rumored green fire, and carpenters hastened to reinforce ships with extra planking. The tension in the air was thick, as if the sea itself held its breath. Arthur made rounds of the islands on a swift sloop, visiting each outpost, speaking to the knights, and looking them in the eye. He offered words of encouragement, reminding them of their vows, that they were the shield of the innocent. Some knights, new to the cause, admitted they felt fear. Arthur told them that fear was no failing. It was giving in to fear that would break them. He felt fear himself, fear of losing more friends, fear of failing those who depended on him. But he carried it in his heart like a shield, never letting it eclipse his purpose. When the enemy fleet finally appeared on the horizon one dawn, the watchers on the cliffs saw sails of many colors, flags from various mercenary companies and slaver cities, some bearing the red flames of Volantis, others the silver harpoons of New Guise. The wind blew from the east, favoring them. Arthur had no illusions that this would be a swift or easy battle. He gathered his captains for one last round of strategy, dividing the fleet into 3 groups. One would engage the mercenaries head-on, aiming to draw them into the narrow straits where the knights had the advantage of familiarity with the waters. The second group would move to flank, setting up a crossfire with mangonels and archers from hidden cliffside positions. The third group remained in reserve, hidden behind a jutting reef, ready to pounce on any unsuspecting foes. And so began one of the largest naval battles the Stepstones had seen in living memory. The mercenary galleys, bristling with scorpions, advanced in disciplined lines. Drums pounded out a steady rhythm that carried across the waves. Arthur's knights sailed forward under the banners of the rising sun, their hearts pounding as they faced a seemingly overwhelming force. The clash was immediate and terrible. Arrows arced overhead, bolts from scorpions hissed through the air, and the roar of colliding hulls filled the morning. Knights in armor leapt onto enemy decks, engaging in furious melee. In the straits, the water churned red with blood. Fire broke out on multiple ships, and black smoke began to obscure the sky. Arthur led the Dawnstar directly into the heart of the mercenary line, trusting the smaller, more maneuverable ship to outflank heavier galleys. His archers rained arrows upon the enemy, while the knights prepared grappling hooks to board. He himself deflected a scorpion bolt with Dawn, a near-impossible feat that left sparks dancing in the air. Cheers went up from his men at the spectacle. Meanwhile, the second group, hidden along the cliffs, unleashed mangonel fire, hurling stones and pots of burning oil down onto the mercenaries. The narrow straits became a death trap for those who sought to pass through. Yet the enemy's numbers were significant. They kept coming, ship after ship, and many of Arthur's allies began to falter under the relentless onslaught. At the height of the battle, a monstrous vessel loomed into view. It was an old Valyrian war galley, refitted with iron plating and sporting a terrifying figurehead shaped like a draconic maw. From its deck, a group of mercenaries ignited jars of green wildfire, hurling them into the sea around the knights' ships. Sickly green flames erupted on the water's surface, burning even where there was no tinder, creeping closer to the knights' hulls. The heat was unbearable, and the screams of men who caught fire seared the ears. Panic threatened to consume Arthur's fleet. If the green fire spread, it could trap them all and turn the straits into a floating inferno. Arthur realized that the monstrous vessel had to be taken out immediately, or all would be lost. With a signal to his helmsman, he steered the Dawnstar around the edges of the green flames, skillfully navigating gusts of wind and dangerous currents. The crew of the Great War galley saw him coming and redirected their scorpions, launching bolts that splintered the Dawnstar's deck. Still, Arthur pressed on. At the critical moment, he ordered his archers to unleash a volley of flame-tipped arrows at the galley's jars of wildfire before they could be hurled. A cacophonous explosion rocked the vessel as the jars ignited on the deck, consuming the mercenaries who had been about to release the deadly payload. With half the enemy crew in flames, the war galley descended into chaos. Arthur maneuvered alongside, throwing grappling lines and leading a boarding party. Battle erupted in a swirl of green flame and acrid smoke. The knights had to be careful not to tread too close to the lingering patches of wildfire. Arthur, fighting through the haze, cut down mercenaries left and right, his silver hair matted with sweat and soot, his face streaked with ash. He reached the helm, where the mercenary captain, clad in black iron, tried to rally his men. In a duel that echoed his past legendary battles, Arthur parried savage blows before driving Dayne through the captain's chest. With that, the last semblance of discipline on the war galley evaporated. Seizing the helm, Arthur commanded the surviving sailors to steer the burning vessel away from the knights' ships and beach it on a small, uninhabited isle off to the side. Smoke billowed high into the sky, marking the vessel's death throes. Meanwhile, the rest of the knights rallied. The reserve group emerged from behind the reef, attacking the mercenaries' rear line. One by one, the enemy ships began to surrender or flee, their captains acknowledging that the Stepstones were not so easily taken. When the final tally was done, Arthur's order had lost many brave knights, and numerous ships were damaged or sunk, but they had carried the day. The mercenary armada lay in ruin. In the aftermath, Arthur stood on the blackened deck of the Dawn Star, surveying the wreckage. Columns of smoke still rose from the water. Debris bobbed among charred bodies. It was a scene of grim victory, a testament to the heavy cost of defiance in these seas. Yet even amidst such destruction, Arthur felt a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. They had protected the Stepstones from a mighty force, proving that their vow was more than empty words. In the weeks that followed, survivors from the enemy fleet were rounded up. Some were ransomed back to the free cities. Others willingly joined Arthur's ranks once they realized their cause was just. Word of this great naval triumph spread across the narrow sea and beyond, cementing Arthur Dayne's new legend. It was said that he shone brightest in the morning sun, leading his knights to victory against impossible odds. Merchant ships flew small banners depicting the rising sun, hoping that it would grant them safe passage if they encountered the knights of the morning's light. Even in the Red Keep, so far removed from these events, people began to speak of Arthur in tones of awe and caution, wondering if King Robert would ever see fit to offer a formal alliance or, conversely, brand Arthur a rival to the throne's authority. But Arthur harbored no desire for crowns or thrones. The Stepstones had always been a place of lawlessness and cruelty, and he was content to carve out a space of honor in those troubled waters. The more territory he secured, the more he realized that this was not simply a mission to root out pirates, but a mission of restoration. A quest to show that the true essence of knighthood could still exist in a world choked by war, betrayal, and greed. His men believed in him because he believed in the sacred vows that guided them, and that belief was not so easily extinguished by fear or bloodshed. There were days of joyous relief, such as when freed slaves reunited with loved ones, or when a merchant caravan reached its destination unmolested, thanks to the knights' escorts. There were also days of anguish, when storms wrecked a ship full of good men or when assassins tried to strike at Arthur in his sleep. Through it all, he stood resolute. The blade named Dayne remained at his side, a silent companion that glowed faintly in the first rays of each morning, a reminder of the unyielding principle that light prevails over darkness. As the seasons turned and the years rolled on, the Stepstones became synonymous with Arthur Dayne's legend at sea. Sailors coined new names for him: the Warden of the Waters, the Dawn at Sea, the Light in the Mist. Bards composed ballads that blended fanciful exaggerations with kernels of truth, recounting how Arthur fought sea dragons, calmed storms with a prayer, or rescued merlings from iron nets. Arthur himself rarely heard these songs, busy as he was with the daily rigors of command. But occasionally, a wandering minstrel would visit one of the nightly outposts and perform, and the men would smile, looking to their commander as if to say, See how they sing of you?" Arthur would only shake his head with a gentle smile, as though embarrassed by the adulation. The Order of the Morning's Light now numbered over 100 knights, not counting squires, sailors, and other supporters. With that many, Arthur had to delegate a great deal of authority. He established a central council of knights, each with a designated role: master of ships, master of provisioning, master of training, and so on. They met periodically to discuss strategy, share intelligence, and ensure that discipline remained high. Arthur oversaw it all, stepping in when disputes arose or when critical decisions needed to be made. Over time, they built a loose but functioning society across the scattered isle. Yes, one bound not by feudal loyalties but by shared ideals. Small communities grew under their protection: fishermen, traders, families who had once been enslaved or exiled. It was far from a utopia, but it was safer and more just than anything the Stepstones had known in generations. Sometimes travelers from Westeros, Essos, or beyond would arrive, curious about this fabled realm of Arthur Dayne. They would find small towers flying white and gold flags, knights patrolling the beaches, children playing in the surf. They would hear stories from the locals of how these knights had saved them from pillage or slavery. Some would scoff, suspecting a veneer of nobility cloaking a more pragmatic or ruthless order. Yet time and time again, they found that the knights truly did adhere to a code, dispensing justice without greed. Even disputes among locals about fishing grounds or stolen goats were handled with fairness. It was not perfect, but it was earnest. And in a world rife with cynicism, that was remarkable. Among the knights, no name carried as much weight as Arthur's own. He had become a living legend, yet also a man of flesh and blood who could be seen training in the yard, repairing sails, or gently comforting a frightened child. Many knights whispered that he was destined for something even greater, that the gods or the stars had chosen him. But Arthur never spoke of such things. He merely continued the work, day after day, wave after wave, dawn after dawn. Years passed. The Stepstones began to resemble a patchwork domain under the Order's watchful eyes. Most pirates either fled, joined the knights, or met the edge of a sword. The slaver cities still sent raiders and hired mercenaries, but these incursions became less frequent and often met with swift defeat. The major powers of Westeros, including King Robert's court, acknowledged the new reality. Letters arrived from the crown, some congratulatory, others cautious, but always formal. The official stance seemed to be that the Stepstones were outside direct royal jurisdiction. Robert, pragmatic and occupied with other matters, saw no immediate need to provoke or punish Arthur's success. And so Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, once sworn to the Targaryen kings and believed dead by most, flourished upon the waves. He had forged a new identity and a new order, one that transcended the old conflicts of the Seven Kingdoms. He was neither rebel nor servant of the crown, neither robber knight nor usurper. He stood for the principles that had once guided him as a kingsguard, to protect, to serve, and to stand against tyranny, wherever it might appear. The Stepstones, once a den of outlaws and despair, was slowly evolving into a haven for those seeking freedom and honest trade. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, Arthur would sometimes walk along the shore of the largest island under their control. He would remove his boots and let the surf curl around his feet, gazing out at the horizon where the sun dipped below the sea. He would think of the journeys that had brought him here, the wars, the betrayals, the heartbreak, and the unwavering desire to stand for something worthwhile. He would recall the fateful fight at the Tower of Joy, the moment he realized the world he had known was slipping away. Yet in that ending, a new beginning had emerged. A gull would cry overhead, and he would turn back to see knights finishing their evening drills, children laughing as they chased each other, fishermen hauling in the last catch of the day. The smell of roasting fish and the echo of lively chatter carried on the breeze. It was a tranquil scene, impossibly distant from the nightmares that had once consumed his life. But the Stepstones had been transformed under his watch, shaped by the steel of his sword and the warmth of his heart. He was no longer simply Arthur Dayne of House Dayne, Sword of the Morning. He had become the guardian of these waters, the founder of a knightly order that promised hope in a harsh world. The waves continued their eternal dance, whispering ancient secrets of the deep. Arthur breathed in the briny air, feeling the grit of sand beneath his heels. He considered the tasks that lay ahead, maintaining the alliance of the islands, ensuring the supply lines remained open, guarding against the next threat that would inevitably arise. Yet for all the challenges, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was his calling now. This was the dream he had chosen to follow. Morning would come again, as it always did, and when the first rays of dawn broke over the water, they would find Arthur Dayne ready at the prow of a ship or atop a coastal rampart, vigilant and calm, the white glow of dawn reflecting the rising light. He had formed a knightly order to patrol the Stepstones, and in doing so had become a legend at sea. A legend that would endure so long as men remembered the shining blade and the promise that as long as dawn broke the darkness, there would be those who stood against it, resolute, unyielding, and hopeful.